Welcome to Americana Archives. Today we had the last installment, Part 6 of the story with the headline, Underground Railroad Reminiscences. This article was written by H.E. Nottingham. It says, one time when this lad was conducting a party, he was almost overtaken by a party with bloodhounds. He sent his passengers who were on foot into the creek and told them to follow it for some distance till he should overtake them on his pony. He put poison meat on the trail to infect the dogs. Then he started back towards his pursuers. He met the slave catchers who demanded the reason for his being out at such a time of night. The lad pretended that he was looking for a lost pocketbook. The slaves also put pepper in their track to confound the scent of the dogs. After the party had gone on, the young conductor galloped up the stream till he found his party. Then they continued their journey unmolested. Newark, as a rule, was a very unhealthy place for the fugitive, but like most every other northern city, it contained a few staunch abolitionists. David Wilson, south of Newark, was one of this kind. Mr. Hollister says that he took as many as 10 at one time from there to Utica. Mr. J.A. Hollister became acquainted with the business while working in William Stevenson's chair factory at Utica. This boy would go to Ironton or Gallipolis on the Ohio River and conduct parties up to the middle of the state. Then others would take them on. He always rode a little bay pony. They seldom followed a road, but proceeded along the streams and valleys, thus making it very difficult to travel very far in a night. His work was done during the 2 years preceding and the first year of the Civil War. Several times his train carried a whole family. One of these was a Lewis family, which comprised several small children. There was one boy, William, about Mr. Hollister's own age. Another group was a Maddox family of about the same number. One of these families was taken to Uncle Joe Adams, the father of Judge Adams, at Mount Vernon. The other to Uncle Jacob Martin's in the same town. Only once did he go to Frederickstown. Then there were 14 in the party. Most of them were handed over to parties in Utica, either one of the four Moores, John, James, David, or Pat, or Mr. Stevenson. Mr. Hollister passed through Granville several times, took meals here, but did not stop long. Mrs. George Stanton, daughter of Mr. Thomas Lusk, says that they lived just across the road from Mr. William Stevenson's chair factory. They used to help feed the black people who were kept in the chair factory basement, but there were too many children in their home circle to keep the fugitives on their own premises without detection. Her grandfather, Mr. James Dunlap, lived 1½ mile north of town. At his place, they had 17 runaways at one time. One of them was a fellow who had his feet frozen off. They thought that if a man in that condition could get through to Canada, there was no reason why any well-bodied person could not. Mr. William Dunlap, her uncle, while bringing a big load of slaves into Utica, upset his cargo. Some were terribly frightened, but none were hurt. Robert McFarland, who lived 1 mile north of Utica, kept a station. Once a man came to him who had escaped on his hands and knees. He had had his feet frozen off. Another time he had 8 in his home, 1 old lady, 4 men, and 3 girls. They were soon passed on to other hands. Many smaller parties found a resting place there for a day or two. A man and his wife stopped there. The woman had caught a severe cold from the exposure they had been subjected to on their trip. She thought that she was surely going to die. Dr. Rogers was summoned, and he soon set the old lady at ease by telling her that she couldn't die after taking his medicine if she wanted to. She seemed to get better immediately, and in a few days they resumed their journey. They came from James Beals, on the other side of Martinsburg. Once, when Robert McFarland's brother was bringing a load of slaves from Martinsburg to Utica, the students of a small college there attempted to take a ride on his rig. He ran the horses for all they were worth, and thereby escaped exposure of his mission. The load was delivered to Peter Kirkpatrick's. This was just after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. James M. Kirkpatrick was station agent in Utica from 1854 to 1859, and he provided a way for many a slave to go by rail to Sandusky. He lived on the hill just east of the station. Miss Jane Stitt recalled seeing slaves at James M. Kirkpatrick's. Just before sending a party of 3 or 4 slaves on their journey, they gave them a bountiful lunch and a pound roll of butter to eat with their bread. How those slaves' big round eyes opened up in astonishment when they saw that they were to have so much butter. In those days, very little butter was made in the South. Mr. James Stitt, father of Mrs. Jane Stitt, lived in Muskingum County. He took fugitives to Mr. Samuel Kirkpatrick's at Rocky Fork. From there they went to J.M. Kirkpatrick's at Utica. Mr. James McCannon, a neighbor of Mr. Stitt, was more active than anyone else in the neighborhood in the business. Miss Stitt recalled seeing the one-woman fugitive at her home. This was a girl to whom she gave some clothes, and then the girl was sent on with 2 others to J.S. McFarland's at Bedford. Mr. Stitt was taking 2 fellows on foot, and he met several young ladies of the neighborhood. The slaves hid along the roadside, and Mr. Stitt pulled his cap down over his eyes and clasped his hands behind him and bowed his head. In this way he passed them without being recognized, thus showing the quick wit necessary in the business. Sometimes it was very difficult to keep the more curious of the slaves from appearing at the attic windows. Quite an interesting account might be written of the Underground Railroad in Utica alone. There were many strong anti-slavery advocates to be found there. The Covenanters could always be depended upon, and there were quite a few of them to be found in Utica. They, however, were not the only ones. Mr. Peter Copeland of Johnstown, Ohio, was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He was not in this vicinity, but perhaps what he has to say about it will not be out of place in this paper. He says that the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 made every man in Ohio a slave catcher. From Bellaire and Wheeling on the Ohio River ran the National Road to Sandusky. P. Copeland lived on that thoroughfare. In 1845, about Christmas time and the 4th of July, a great many fugitives passed along that line. Perhaps in those seasons more freedom was given to the slaves, and they made the best of their opportunities. Mr. Copeland was in the harness business in Savannah. His next-door neighbor was Ezra Garrett and his father. Things looked suspicious about the Garrett place for some time, before Mr. Garrett asked Mr. Copeland if he would like to take a ride. He said, "I'm going toward Lake Erie. We'll start about 9 tonight." Mr. Copeland said, "Now if I'm going to take a hand in this business, I want to know all about it before I start." So the affair was explained to him. A wagon with a layer of hay stood at the back door at 9 o'clock. Nearby lay a lot of bags, apparently filled with grain. In those days, a great deal of grain was shipped to Canada. In Garrett's attic were 5 black men and 2 women. There was a secret stairway that led to the cellar. When searchers came, they were permitted to commence at either the top or the bottom of the house. Then as they went up or down, the fugitives were transferred accordingly. The young, robust slaves were packed into the bottom of the wagon like sardines. Every one was well armed. These bags of grain were not bags of grain, but cut straw packed in sacks for a bluff. These were piled on top of the slaves till it appeared to be a good load of grain. A couple of strings were run over them, so the light bags would not bounce off. Then if they were held up, the driver would cut the strings, and the bags would fly in all directions, and every slave would spring forth, ready to fight to the finish. They reached Ruggles all right, but as they were passing through the outskirts of the village, 2 horsemen met them and demanded them to halt. Ezra Garrett pulled up on the lines, as if he were going to stop, but the horses broke into a dead run. This was a trick he had taught them for just such an occasion. The horsemen soon gave up the chase, so they continued their course in peace. As they neared Fetchvale, Ezra asked his partner what he saw ahead. Peter replied, "A light." "What do you make out of it?" was the next question. "A triangle," was the answer. "That means," said Garrett, "that we do not have to go farther tonight." It was about a 9-inch triangle, and had it not been there, they would have had to go 4 miles farther. Mr. Baker was the station agent there. He was a wealthy man, and spent a great deal of his time and money in the Underground Railroad business. As they approached the gate, it was swung open for them, and at the barn, the doors were open also, and shut as soon as the wagon was in. Mr. Baker was expecting them. The passengers were hastily hustled into the cellar of the house. Then Mr. Garrett introduced Mr. Copeland and Mr. Baker, who immediately broke into a rage because Garrett was not more cautious in the business. Mr. Copeland is a Scotchman, and in characteristic fashion, he informed Mr. Baker that he himself was just as good as any other man, and that he could be trusted just as far. Mr. Baker replied that it was not a good thing to teach a foreigner to break our laws as soon as he reached this country. Mr. Copeland had been here scarcely 3 months before he took his initial trip on the Underground Railroad. However, it was the first of many. Sometimes he went to Oberlin. In Sandusky, a group of runaways were pursued very closely. In fact, they had just boarded the ship and the gangplank raised when the pursuers rushed onto the dock. They demanded the captain to lower the plank that they might get their slaves. The captain pointed to the Union Jack and said, "There are no slaves under that flag." Then the master threatened to follow in another boat and force the surrender of the fugitives. The captain replied that every man on board was armed to the teeth for just such men as he, and if he came aboard, it was at his own risk. Needless to say, the attempt was given up. In Savannah, where Mr. Copeland was in business with two other young harness makers, there were free men who spent most of their time in capturing fugitives and returning them to their masters. In this way, they made an easy living. There were free slaves who were widely advertised. They were described very graphically, one being a big 6-foot square-shouldered fellow, another as a medium-sized man well proportioned, and the third was a little feminine-built fellow. A reward of $3,000 was offered for them dead or alive. One night, as the loafers were talking about the rich prize for the captors of these free slaves, 3 country lads came in from west of town. In that neighborhood lived a good old lady called Mother Harvey. She was noted as being friendly to the fugitives or anyone else who needed help. In the hotel, the loafers' lounging place, these country fellows told about meeting free slaves near Mrs. Harvey's that would answer the description of the free fugitives under discussion. They said that they would swear that the fellows were at Mrs. Harvey's, and in fact the free fellows they had met were there getting away with a healthy lunch set out by Mrs. Harvey. She took the precaution to bar the doors as soon as they were within the house. The free slave catchers started immediately for Mrs. Harvey's. When they reached the place, the largest of the men stood guard at the back door, the other 2 taking the front. Before the guards were aware of what was taking place, the big black man rushed out the back door, caught the slave catcher by the collar with one hand and the seat of the trousers with the other, and literally threw him over a nearby fence into a big tangle of briar bushes. The other 2 fellows dashed out the front door, overpowered the men there, and fled. When the startled and surprised whites regained their equilibrium, they followed in hot pursuit. The ebony lads encircled the town and arrived at Mr. Reese's place, another well-known station on the Underground Railroad on the opposite side of the town. Their place was on a high hill that gradually sloped down to the creek back of their buildings. Along this creek were many second-growth willows and sycamores. As soon as the pursued perceived that they were corralled again, they dashed out the back door, down the slope with their enemies close upon their heels. When they reached the undergrowth, they dropped in behind a tree, and as their pursuers came along, shoved them over the bank into the deep swimming hole. Surely those were smart slaves. When the dripping, briar-scratched men returned to the village, a great commotion was stirred up. 3 days later, it was discovered that Mr. Joseph Parks, a big, well-built fellow, one of the harness makers referred to above, was one of the black men. Milton Pollock, a little fellow, was another, and the third was Mr. Copeland, who answered the description of the middleman. They were all young and went out with black faces and old clothes put on over their regular apparel. After shoving their would-be captors into the creek, they had returned to one of their homes, removed their disguise, and joined the excited crowd on the streets. Mrs. Reese had recognized the men as soon as they entered her house, but she was cautioned not to expose them. Someone had, however, and the chagrined victims of the trick became very angry. They went to Attorney Fulton, who later became General Fulton, and asked him to take up the case. He advised them to let the matter drop, so they took his advice. Such pranks as that tended to keep up the ever-growing interest in the contentions between the anti-slavery and pro-slavery advocates. Mr. Copeland's last trip was with a young fellow by the name of Armstrong. He had become an abolitionist from the influence brought to bear on him at Wheeling. He took 4 of his grandfather's slaves and 3 of his own father's, drove to Wheeling with them, and left the team at the livery stable, stating that his grandfather would call for them in a few days. Then he crossed the Bel Air and went on up the National Road to Mr. Garrett's place. Peter Copeland took them on to Mr. Baker's. Mr. Armstrong returned a few weeks later to Mr. Garrett's and worked for him, till rewards for his apprehension began to indicate that the United States was not a healthy place for him. So he returned to Canada. Since that time, Mr. Copeland has not heard from him. It should be recalled that although the experiences in connection with the personal liberty laws and the Underground Railroad are very interesting, to some their chief historical significance lies not so much in the actual work done, but in the manifestation of the attitude of the people towards slavery and the incentive to greater effort this close contact with the oppressed must have given. Such scenes as Captain Chapman relates must have made a lasting impression on all who witnessed them. On reaching Canada, the slaves would ask, "Is this Canada?" when Captain Chapman answered yes, there are no slaves in this country. Then he continued, I witnessed a scene that I shall never forget. They seemed to be transformed. A new light shone in their eyes. Their tongues were loosened. They laughed and cried, prayed and sang praises, fell upon the ground and kissed it, hugged and kissed each other, crying, Bless the Lord. Oh, I'm free before I die. Thus we see without a great organization, a wonderful amount of work was accomplished. It seems almost marvelous that such immense results were obtained without a great, well-systemized organization. Those connected with the business had usually well-understood local methods, but there were very few universal systems. Nothing but the intense interest in the oppressed and conviction of the laborers could have accomplished what they did, at such great cost and risk as many of them subjected themselves to. There were many who readily broke the Fugitive Law of 1850, who were staunch supporters of most every other law. These people went by the theory that it was not wrong to break a man-made law when it interfered with a divine law. The end. This story came from the great state of Ohio, being reported in the Granville Times of February 8th, 1912. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.